He hoarded history until one item turned deadly. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Comment your location. It's always exciting to see where our detectives are based. You're the treasure in this collection of minds. Let's search. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light over the quiet village of Little Dithering, bathing the neat hedgerows and thatched roofs in a comforting glow. There was a pleasant sort of hush in the air, broken only by the distant drone of a lawn-mower and the chirp of a robin perched on the edge of the vicarage wall. It was a Sunday like any other, or so it seemed. At the edge of the village, behind ivy-wreathed iron gates, stood Elliston House, a sprawling Georgian manor with slightly sagging shutters and a weathered charm that whispered of generations long past. The house had recently become the subject of much village interest, for it had been purchased 6 months ago by the enigmatic Mr. Oswald Pentreath, a retired art and antiquities dealer from London. A man of peculiar habits and reserved manners, Mr. Pentreath had rarely been seen beyond his own front gate. That was until he announced, via a crisply written note delivered to the grocer, the postmistress, and the vicar's wife, that he would be hosting an afternoon gathering to display certain rarities of personal significance. It had set tongues wagging. "He must be nearing death's door," said Mrs. Mulliner from the bakery, dusting flour off her hands. "Men like that, collectors, they don't show their treasures unless they're about to shuffle off this mortal coil." "I heard he once owned a Raphael sketch," whispered young Cynthia from the post office, eyes wide with awe. "And something Roman, like a dagger or a cup. Poisoned, maybe." Miss Jane Marple, seated by the hearth in her neat cottage on Church Lane, merely sipped her tea and smiled faintly as she listened to her maid's recitation of the latest gossip. She didn't offer any opinions. Not yet. The day of the gathering arrived with brilliant sunshine and a gentle breeze that rustled the lavender in Miss Marple's front garden. At precisely 3 o'clock, a modest parade of guests walked or drove up the gravel path to Elliston House. Among them were the Reverend and Mrs. Hale, Colonel Montague, retired, but still formidable, Miss Lydia Carswell, a spinster with a métier eye for both art and inheritance, and Mr. Cedric Blythe, the solicitor who handled most of the old family's wills in these parts. Inside the drawing-room, Oswald Pentreath stood beside a long table draped in burgundy velvet. On it, arranged like relics in a shrine, were objects that gleamed and glimmered in the afternoon light: a delicate Fabergé egg, a carved jade figurine, a narrow parchment sealed with an ancient crest, and a strange, narrow mirror framed in tarnished silver. Pentreath's voice was low and raspy as he addressed the assembled guests. "These are the remnants of a life spent in pursuit of beauty, and at times deceit." His pale eyes flicked across the room, unreadable. "Each item has its tale, but one in particular has a secret." Before anyone could ask what that secret was, a loud crash rang out from behind the velvet curtains near the rear of the room. The lights flickered. A few women gasped when the curtains were pulled back, revealing the narrow passage that led to the conservatory. Mr. Pentreath was found slumped in his chair, his hand still resting on the silver mirror. His head lolled at a strange angle. He was dead. For a few breathless moments no one moved. Then Lydia Carswell screamed, and the mirror clattered to the floor. By the time the local constable arrived, summoned by a hastily pedalled bicycle, the guests were scattered about the house like startled pigeons. Mr. Blythe offered his legal insight. Mrs. Hale murmured about the shock. Colonel Montague demanded someone fetch a doctor, though it was clearly too late. Miss Marple, who had arrived late due to a delay in her walking route and had just stepped through the front door, stood quietly in the hall. She observed the confusion, the overlapping voices, the drawn faces of people who had not expected their afternoon tea to end in death. She noted, too, that the silver-framed mirror had been removed from the floor before she entered, and was now nowhere in sight. And then she saw something that made her pause. A speck of red, just a faint smudge on the edge of the parchment. No one else noticed. Not yet. Miss Marple looked around the grand old house, its long shadows beginning to stretch across the carpet, and murmured, as if to herself, "How very curious." And thus began the most puzzling affair little Dithering had ever known. The news of Mr. Willoughby Drake's sudden and dramatic demise spread through Little Witchwood with the merciless efficiency of a summer thunderstorm, loud, unstoppable, and leaving behind a trail of disrupted picnics and half-eaten trifles. By the time the sun dipped behind the vicarage steeple, every cottage from the thatched-roofed Willow's End to the brick and ivy facade of Honeysuckle Grange buzzed with theory and speculation. Cups of tea were poured, heads were shaken with appropriate solemnity, and voices, though hushed, carried a certain relish as they recounted the gory details of the body in the chair, the trickle of blood, and the mysterious scarab found at the scene. "Poison," declared Mrs. Dunthorpe confidently, slicing her fruitcake with unnecessary vigour. "You mark my words, exotic and theatrical, just like that man. He probably brought it back from one of his heathen tombs." "Or he choked," countered Mr. Giles Haycroft, the village grocer and self-appointed rationalist. "Old men do, you know, especially when they insist on wearing those ridiculous cravats. Wouldn't surprise me if it got caught and strangled." "Him half to death. I heard he was cursed," whispered Sally Penfleet, the vicar's daughter, with a thrill of excitement. "That scarab thing, someone said it glowed." "Don't be ridiculous," snapped her mother. "Things don't glow, not unless you've been drinking cider on an empty stomach." At the heart of all this quiet pandemonium sat Miss Marple, quite contentedly sipping her tea in the drawing-room of Mrs. Weatherby, who had invited a few of the more thoughtful ladies for a delicate discussion on the day's events under the polite veil of mourning. The lace curtains twitched every few minutes as someone peered out toward the lane, as though expecting a second body to arrive by wheelbarrow. Mrs. Weatherby herself was flushed with significance. "He was just sitting there, you say?" she repeated for the third time, turning to Miss Marple with eyes aglow. "As if he simply dropped off?" "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "though I doubt it was a peaceful departure." "Oh, but why would anyone want to kill Mr. Drake?" asked Miss Felicity Pomfret, whose habitual anxiety had only increased since the unfortunate episode with the hedgehog in her pantry. "He was unpleasant, yes, but murder in Little Witchwood." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "One should never underestimate how far resentment can grow in fertile soil, my dear, even in a village as charming as ours." There was a pause, during which Mrs. Weatherby's cat stretched languidly across the hearthrug and yawned as if bored by human dramatics. "Well, if you ask me," said Mrs. Weatherby in a low voice, "someone had it in for him. I mean, just think of that collection of his, half of it probably stolen. All those curiosities. A body like that attracts trouble." Felicity Pomfret looked nervously over her shoulder. "Do you think someone broke in?" "No sign of forced entry," Miss Marple said gently, and the door to the conservatory was open for the fete. Anyone could have walked in. No need to break in at all. This was followed by a thoughtful silence, broken only by the gentle clink of teaspoons and the distant bark of a dog. It wasn't long before the village constable, young Sergeant Ridley, made his round of inquiries. He was earnest, well-meaning and chronically intimidated by Miss Marple, though he never admitted it. He found her seated on her front step. Next morning, a basket of darning in her lap and a teapot steaming nearby. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his helmet and shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Just doing the rounds." "How efficient of you, Sergeant," she said, threading her needle. "Have the doctor determined the cause of death yet?" He cleared his throat. "Well, there's some uncertainty. No visible wounds apart from the bit of blood, but the village doctor thinks it might be internal."
Maybe his heart. Was the scarab examined? It's being sent to the station in Much Biddington. They've a man who knows about such things. He looked slightly embarrassed. Course it could just be a paperweight. Mr. Drake had a fondness for the dramatic. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but I've always found that people rarely die in theatrical positions unless someone arranges it so. Sergeant Ridley blinked. You don't think he staged it himself?
"Goodness, no," Miss Marple said with a soft chuckle. "Suicides are rarely so considerate as to choose public occasions. No, this has the feeling of performance, but not for the deceased's benefit. For the audience's." The young sergeant looked daunted by this. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his notepad, "we're keeping an open mind. Just between us, though." He leaned in. "The brother's back." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Lionel?" "Yes, ma'am." Turned.
Up at the manor late last night. Took the night train.
No one knew he was coming, not even the housekeeper. "How interesting," she said softly. "And timely." "He says he received a letter from Mr. Drake, said it was urgent, written 2 days before the fete." Miss Marple's needle paused. "Did he bring the letter with him?" "No, says he left it in his luggage, which, conveniently, was misplaced at the station." Curious indeed. After the sergeant left, Miss Marple rose and made her way slowly to the back garden, where sparrows flitted among the hollyhocks and bees droned about their business with enviable focus. She stood quietly, watching the natural order of things, everything moving in its appointed rhythm, everything with its role. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that murder rarely disrupted this rhythm. Rather, it hid within it, mimicking normalcy so precisely that only the most subtle misstep gave it away. And there had been a misstep. She could feel it, not in what people were saying, but in what they had failed to notice. Later that day, she paid a visit to the Drake residence, where a black wreath had been hung upon the front door, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Inglethorpe, answered with red-rimmed eyes and a practised curtsy. "Such a tragedy, Miss Marple," the woman said, as she led her through the entrance hall. "He was not an easy man, but he paid well and he kept his promises." "Did he have visitors often?" "Hardly ever," the housekeeper said. "Only tradesmen or historians, and even then he kept them at arm's length." "And his brother?" Mrs. Inglethorpe stiffened slightly. "We never spoke of Mr. Lionel. Not since the argument, 15 years ago that was. Over money, I think, and some woman." Miss Marple nodded, filing it away. In the cabinet room, now sealed off and dimmed, she looked once more at the chair where Willoughby Drake had died. The bloodstain on the cravat had been removed, but a faint mark remained, ghost-like and oddly symmetrical. She turned her attention to the shelves, hundreds of objects arranged with obsessive care. But it was the space beneath one glass case
that drew her eye. A small stand, empty, dustless. Was something removed?
she asked. Mrs. Inglethorpe hesitated. "Oh yes, a little brass key kept in a box. Mr. Drake said it opened something important, but he never told me what." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mrs. Inglethorpe. That's very helpful." Outside, as she made her way down the path lined with foxgloves, she noticed someone watching from behind the curtain in the upstairs window. A pale face. Sharp. Unmoving. Lionel Drake. He did not wave, he did not blink. He simply watched. Miss Marple, with her parasol tucked beneath one arm, looked up at the window and gave the faintest nod. Then she walked away as the clouds began to gather once more over Little Witchwood. The village wore its mourning like a borrowed coat, awkwardly and without conviction. Though respectable sympathies were expressed and church bells tolled with due gravity, there lingered beneath the surface a bright glint of curiosity. For in Little Witchwood nothing stirred the blood so thoroughly as a good death, except, of course, a suspicious one. Constable Phipps, fresh from Much Biddington and sent to oversee the investigation, while Sergeant Ridley assisted with formalities, set up camp in the small side room of the vicarage. He was a squat man with watery eyes and an unfortunate wheeze, and he approached the matter with the slightly flustered caution of one unaccustomed to anything more taxing than misplaced bicycles. Miss Marple, ever polite, paid him a visit under the guise of delivering an elderflower cordial recipe to Mrs. Penfleet, the vicar's wife. Finding the constable alone at the dining table with a pile of rather disordered notes, she offered a gentle smile and inquired if he'd like some tea. "Oh, yes." "That would be very kind, Miss Marple," he said, removing his spectacles and rubbing his brow. "Quite a tangle, this one, isn't it?" "I rather think so," she said, as she poured. "You must forgive us country folk, we tend to overreact. But when death arrives in a conservatory chair during a village fete, it does rather rattle the usual rhythm." Constable Phipps gave a short chuckle. "Indeed. And to be frank, there's no clear evidence of foul play yet. No obvious wounds, no signs of a struggle. Though Dr. Partridge suspects some form of ingestion, a toxin perhaps." "Ah," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "And the scarab?" "Unusual, certainly, but no clear markings. It's being examined by a man in Much Biddington. Works with the museum there. We'll know more soon." She nodded and let the silence stretch. "I do wonder," she said softly after a time, "whether you've spoken with Lionel Drake yet." Phipps frowned. "The brother?" "Briefly. He seemed quite shaken. Claimed he received a letter summoning him, but conveniently he can't produce it. Misplaced luggage, he says. Poor timing, that." Miss Marple sipped her tea, the steam rising around her face like the mist that curled through the lanes each dawn. "Indeed, though it is often the untimely things that point us in the right direction." She left shortly thereafter, offering no conclusions, no direct suggestions, just a few musings and a faint smile. It was her way. Meanwhile, gossip thickened in the village like fog. The Women's Guild had decided, unofficially of course, that Mr. Lionel Drake had returned to Little Witchwood with vengeance in his heart and poison in his pocket. His long absence, rumoured scandal, and the fortune he'd supposedly been denied were all stacked heavily against him in the court of public opinion. At the post office, Mrs. Cribben murmured to anyone who'd listen that she'd seen Lionel arriving. That night, no luggage in hand, mind, just a single leather briefcase. At the butcher's, Mr. Tilbury said he recalled Lionel from youth. Always had a nasty way about him, that one, sharp as a blade and twice as cold. And at the Rectory Garden Club, Mrs. Pomfret insisted she remembered an old story about a woman named Esme, some foreign widow who had been entangled with both Drake brothers once upon a time, until she vanished without so much as a farewell. Back at the Drake residence, Lionel himself had adopted the air of a reluctant heir. He walked the garden with the solemnity of a priest and spoke little. But on the third day following Willoughby's death, he took it upon himself to invite Miss Marple for tea. She accepted with quiet interest. The drawing-room had changed. A decanter of port sat on the sideboard. The old armchair where Willoughby used to sit had been moved, and the fireplace had been cleared of the brass fender that once guarded the flames. Lionel offered her a seat by the window where the light fell gently across the rosewood tea-table. "My brother," Lionel began without preamble, "was a man of deep pride and deeper secrets. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, and yet, 2 days before his death I received a letter, unsigned but in his hand, urging me to return. He wrote that he had discovered something that would change everything." Miss Marple sipped her tea, the steam rising around her face like the mist that curled through the lanes each dawn. "Indeed, though it is often the untimely things that point us in the right direction." She left shortly thereafter, offering no conclusions, no direct suggestions, just a few musings and a faint smile. It was her way. Meanwhile, gossip thickened in the village like fog. The Women's Guild had decided, unofficially of course, that Mr. Lionel Drake had returned too. Little Witchwood, with vengeance in his heart and poison in his pocket, his long absence, rumoured scandal, and the fortune he'd supposedly been denied were all stacked heavily against him in the court of public opinion. At the post office, Mrs. Cribben murmured to anyone who'd listen that she'd seen Lionel arriving. That night, no luggage in hand, mind, just a single leather briefcase. At the butcher's, Mr. Tilbury said he recalled Lionel from youth. Always had a nasty way about him, that one, sharp as a blade and twice as cold. And at the Rectory Garden Club, Mrs. Pomfret insisted she remembered an old story about a woman named Esme, some foreign widow who had been entangled with both Drake brothers once upon a time until she vanished without so much as a farewell. Back at the Drake residence, Lionel himself had adopted the air of a reluctant heir. He walked the garden with the solemnity of a priest and spoke little. But on the third day following Willoughby's death, he took it upon himself to invite Miss Marple for tea. She accepted with quiet interest. The drawing-room had changed. A decanter of port sat on the sideboard. The old armchair where Willoughby used to sit had been moved, and the fireplace had been cleared of the brass fender that once guarded the flames. Lionel offered her a seat by the window, where the light fell gently across the rosewood tea-table. "My brother," Lionel began without preamble, "was a man of deep pride and deeper secrets. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, and yet, 2 days before his death I received a letter, unsigned but in his hand, urging me to return. He wrote that he had discovered something that would change everything." Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately.
"And you believed him?" Lionel's mouth twisted. "Willoughby rarely lied. He concealed but did not invent. I came out of obligation and curiosity. And now he's dead, yes." His eyes darkened. "Which makes the timing unsettling." Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect motive," he replied, voice sharp.
"I don't believe Willoughby died by accident. He was old, yes, but not frail, and he would never have chosen such a public moment for something so final." Miss Marple allowed a faint frown. "Then if not suicide or natural causes, what do you suggest?" "I don't know," Lionel said, "but the key is that collection of his, that cursed cabinet. He guarded it more than he ever guarded his relationships. If someone wished to silence him, I believe the reason lies within that room." Poured them both another cup. "I intend to find out what he meant by change everything, Miss Marple," he continued. "And if that means opening old wounds, so be it." After tea, Miss Marple walked slowly down the garden path, where the foxgloves leaned lazily in the breeze. She paused by the conservatory, now locked, but the glass still offered glimpses inside. Something stirred faintly in her memory. Not a fact, not yet, but a feeling. A pattern waiting to be named. That evening she visited Mrs. Weatherby once, more under the guise of returning a borrowed shawl. But it wasn't the shawl that brought her there. It was a name. "Esme," she said, as she folded the wool gently across her lap. "Do you remember an Esme, a foreign woman connected to the Drakes?" Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "Oh, Esme de Laurentiis. Half Italian, I think. Quite the beauty, years ago. Caused something of a stir. Willoughby brought her to the village. Fate, in 1912, dressed like a silent film star. It all ended in tears, of course. She left abruptly, and neither brother ever mentioned her again." "Do you remember why?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned. There were whispers that she had been engaged to Lionel but preferred Willoughby. Or perhaps the reverse. Honestly, it was all rather dramatic. "And no one heard from her again?" "Not to my knowledge." Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, tapping one gloved finger on the armrest. Then she rose. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. "I do believe I'll take a short walk before supper." She went not toward home, but toward the churchyard. And there, beneath the old yew tree and near the path that led to the rectory garden, stood a modest gravestone worn with time. The name had faded, but she could just make out the inscription, "Esme Laurentiis, 1890-1913, beloved and betrayed." Miss Marple read the dates once more, 1 year after the fete, 1 year after her arrival. She stood there a long while, until the sky turned violet and the bells began to ring for evensong, and as she turned to go she whispered, "Secrets buried deep rarely stay that way." By the end of the week, the roses in Little Witchwood had begun to droop. Whether from the unseasonal heat or the pressure of village scandal weighing heavily in the air, no one could say for certain. But Miss Marple, who had seen both roses and reputations wilt under harsher circumstances, moved through the growing tension with characteristic calm. Sergeant Ridley returned to duty from Much Biddington that morning with fresh updates and, perhaps more notably, a new sense of frustration. He met Miss Marple outside the village bakery, where she was collecting a loaf of treacle bread and exchanging polite smiles with young Mrs. Hargrove, who insisted her baby had begun smiling, at least in dreams. "I'm afraid," the sergeant said as they strolled down the lane, "that our good doctor remains vague." "About Mr. Drake's cause of death?" Miss Marple inquired gently, handing him a warm scone from her paper bag. "Thank you." "Yes." The preliminary results show no visible trauma, no wounds, no bruising, no clear signs of poisoning. But his internal organs showed faint signs of stress. The heart was slightly enlarged, not uncommon for his age. Dr. Partridge is leaning toward natural causes. But Ridley hesitated, chewing thoughtfully. "There was something odd?" Said Miss Marple, watching a wood pigeon land on the church's weather vane. They found faint traces of something under his fingernails. A kind of residue. Lab results are pending, but one chap said it could be mineral-based, possibly a resin or powder. "Interesting," she murmured. "Do you suppose he touched something just before he died?" "It's possible. Something from his collection, perhaps. Or perhaps someone handed it to him." That suggestion lingered in the air between them. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You mentioned before that a key was missing." "Yes. The housekeeper mentioned it. Small, brass usually displayed in a velvet box in the cabinet room, but no sign of it now. Miss Marple paused. If I were to hazard a guess, Sergeant, I'd say Mr. Drake summoned his brother not to make peace, but to deliver a warning or perhaps a demand. That key may have been the crux of it. And you think Lionel Drake may have killed him for it? I think, said Miss Marple, that we must be careful not to settle too soon. Suspicion, like smoke, has a habit of drifting toward the nearest heat. Later that afternoon, the village's first and most favoured suspect emerged publicly, Lionel Drake himself. At the inn, outside the bakery, and even in the hush of the church pews, his name fell into conversation with increasing certainty. He was always the wild one, said Miss Felicity Pomfrey, looking unusually firm as she arranged chrysanthemums for Sunday service, and he returned just in time to inherit the estate. He hasn't even asked about the funeral arrangements, added Mrs. Cribben darkly. Says he's too busy sorting out legal affairs. I ask you, is that natural? But it was. At the Crown and Stag, the local pub, that the most damning story emerged, delivered in low tones by Mr. Haycroft the grocer. After 2 pints and a strong opinion, my cousin's boy, he told the assembled company, works in the records office at Much Biddington, told me in confidence Lionel Drake's finances are a mess, gambling, debts all over Europe. This inheritance would be his salvation. That evening, as the sun burned low and the hedgerows turned bronze in the dying light, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit the Drake residence once more. She was met at the door not by the housekeeper but by Lionel himself, who opened it with an expression somewhere between weariness and wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, "you have an uncanny habit of arriving at moments of reflection. I
often find reflection is best done in company, Mr. Drake. May I?"
He stepped aside with a sigh and led her to the drawing-room where the fire had been lit despite the warmth. A decanter of brandy stood open on the sideboard. "Still no letter, I presume?" she asked, settling into the armchair nearest the fire. "No," he said curtly. "The railway claims my luggage was misrouted to Bristol. I'm still waiting," she nodded, knitting her fingers lightly in her lap. "May I ask, did you and your brother ever share ownership of the collection?" He raised an eyebrow. "No, Willoughby was fiercely territorial, possessive even. He believed I had no appreciation for true antiquity. I once suggested he part with a few lesser items to settle our father's old debts, and he all but disowned."
"Me? And yet you were the sole beneficiary in his will?" His expression darkened. "Yes, quite unexpectedly. The solicitor showed me the document yesterday."
"Signed and witnessed 3 months ago. Everything to me, the house, the collection, even the cat, though I believe it's long dead." Miss Marple gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. "That was generous of him." "I found it suspicious," Lionel said bluntly. "We had not spoken since 1913, and then suddenly this? Either guilt changed his heart, or someone else's hand was involved." Miss Marple studied him with that particular softness of expression that masked a razor-sharp curiosity. "Have you looked through the cabinet yet?" "Not thoroughly. It's locked again. The key's still missing." "I wonder," she said, gently, "if the key was intended for you, or to keep something from you." Before she left, Lionel walked her to the door. As they stood in the fading light of the porch, he turned to her suddenly. "You think I killed him?" he said, not with accusation, but something closer to resignation. "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that I have seen too many polite monsters to believe only the obvious ones are dangerous." She left him standing there, half-shadowed, as the moon began to rise behind the old yew trees. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple penned a short note to her nephew, Raymond, requesting a reference to a certain antiquities dealer in London who might know more about Mesopotamian scarabs. She then prepared a modest supper, cold ham, sliced cucumber, and a biscuit, and ate in quiet thought. Across the village, in a house off the green, a different kind of supper was unfolding. Mrs. Dunthorpe, still resplendent in widow's black, despite having never married, hosted her niece, young Evelyn Marchmont, recently returned to the village after years abroad. Evelyn had been one of the few visitors to the fête who had lingered inside the cabinet room for longer than most. When asked by neighbours, she had laughed it off as curiosity. But that night, after Mrs. Dunthorpe had gone to bed, Evelyn sat at the writing desk in the guest room, examining something small and golden between her thumb and forefinger. It was a key. She wrapped it in a handkerchief and placed it carefully into a drawer, then locked the drawer and slipped the key into her shoe. As she turned off the lamp and pulled the covers around her, she stared up at the ceiling, eyes wide open and the dark. Morning in Little Witchwood dawned with deceptive serenity. The sky was a clear, innocent blue, the air sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass. But beneath that polished calm, something had shifted. Conversations paused more, abruptly. Doors closed just a touch faster. People began to watch one another more closely, unsure whether the murderer walked among them or sipped tea beside them. At St. Mildred's Church, the Sunday congregation gathered with an unusual punctuality, drawn not only by faith but by the lure of shared speculation. As the vicar gave his sermon, on forgiveness no less, eyes wandered. Lionel Drake was notably absent, which was discussed before the end of the first hymn and dissected thoroughly by the final benediction. Miss Marple, in her usual seat near the back and a little to the left, observed all this with quiet interest. But her mind was not on absences, nor even on Lionel. Her thoughts returned again and again to that vanished key and a particular glance, quick, uncertain, that she had caught from Evelyn Marchmont the day before, a glance toward the conservatory, a glance that had not belonged to a casual visitor. Later that morning, after a polite word with the vicar and a short stroll through the cemetery where the name Esme Laurentis still lingered in her thoughts, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Dunthorpe's ivy-covered cottage under the guise of returning a borrowed volume of Pride and Prejudice. She was admitted with cordial fuss, ushered into the drawing-room with its usual scent of lavender polish and old roses. Evelyn Marchmont joined them moments later, dressed neatly in a pale blue dress, her hair pinned just a touch too carefully. Miss Marple thought she looked tired, though not in the way a poor night's sleep causes, but in the brittle, nervous manner of someone carrying a secret too heavy for comfort. "I do hope your stay has been pleasant so far, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly as she sipped her tea. "Oh, yes," Evelyn replied, smiling too quickly, "though I confess I hadn't expected quite such excitement." "No one ever does," Miss Marple said gently. "But then, murders are like certain kinds of mushrooms. They flourish in hidden, damp places, usually after long neglect." Keats blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing." Miss Marple patted her gloves. "I only meant to say that Little Witchwood, like any village, has its share of secrets. Time doesn't always heal. Sometimes it simply buries." Mrs. Dunthorpe, who had gone to fetch some ginger biscuits, returned just then, and the conversation turned to less ominous subjects. But as Miss Marple stood to leave, she paused in the hallway near a narrow side table on which stood a small, decorative box, a trinket container shaped like a miniature book. "My aunt collects those," Evelyn said, coming up behind her. "They're
Rather charming, don't you think?" Oh, yes, Miss Marple said. And so useful, just the right size for something one wishes to keep safe. A ring, a letter, or even a key. She saw the flicker cross Evelyn's face, barely a twitch.
But to Miss Marple, it was as bright and telling as a flare in the night. She took her leave soon after, but the impression lingered. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself invited to tea at the home of Mrs. Inglethorpe, the late Mr. Drake's housekeeper. The widow-like devotion the woman displayed since her employer's death had stirred the sympathy of the village. It was said she had worked for him since her youth, and though few knew the exact nature of their arrangement, her grief was widely accepted as genuine. "I can't make sense of it, Miss Marple," she said as she poured the tea with trembling hands. "He was in excellent health for a man his age. Fussy, yes, but careful. Always ate plainly, never drank much, didn't even take sugar." "No sugar," Miss Marple repeated softly. "And yet he kept those ornate sugar bowls in the cabinet."
Room? Oh, those weren't for use, Mrs. Inglethorpe said quickly. Just part of the display. Some had inscriptions, others odd carvings. One was shaped like a bird's head. Egyptian, I think.
"And were they cleaned regularly?" "Only dusted. He didn't like anyone touching the contents." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Inglethorpe's brows furrowed. "Do you think something was in them?" Miss Marple did not reply directly. Instead, she asked to see Mr. Drake's study. The housekeeper hesitated, then led her down the narrow hall and into the small, shadowed room that overlooked the side garden. The curtains had been drawn, the desk untouched. A faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air. Was he in here often? "Every night," she said, "sometimes for hours, writing letters, reading old ledgers." Miss Marple moved carefully through the room. Her hand brushed over the titles of dusty books, The Lost Civilizations, Egypt, and The Undying Soul, On the Trail of Babylon. And then she noticed a drawer slightly ajar. Inside it were correspondence, mostly dull administrative notes and receipts, but one envelope, tucked at the back, bore no address and had been carefully sealed with wax. Miss Marple glanced toward the housekeeper. "I shan't open it," she said, and she didn't. Instead, she noted the initials scrawled on the back of the envelope, E. M. Evelyn Marchmont. The study yielded nothing more, but the letter, even unopened, had told Miss Marple something she suspected. There had been contact between Evelyn and Mr. Drake before the fete, and whatever had passed between them had not been shared with the police. That evening, Lionel Drake came to call. Miss Marple had, in fact, been expecting him. "I've heard," he said curtly, "that I'm now the talk of the town." "I should say you've been the talk of the town since birth," Miss Marple said, passing him a plate of lemon biscuits. "But yes, you are quite popular at present." "I'd like to put an end to it," he said. "I've decided to grant access to the cabinet room. Let the villagers come and see for themselves. Nothing is missing, nothing stolen. I have nothing to hide." "A bold move," Miss Marple said, "though not without risk." He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Exposing the contents of a locked room often reveals more than one expects. But then again, it may be precisely what someone doesn't want. Open eyes, open questions." He paused. "You believe the killer left something behind?" "I believe," she said softly, "that killers are like magpies. They're drawn to objects. Often the crime is not about the victim, but the thing, what was taken, what was hidden, what was feared." Lionel gave a low breath, a frown tightening his brow. "Then perhaps we're chasing the wrong ghost entirely." That night, in the hush that only a village at rest can produce, Evelyn Marchmont returned to the locked drawer in her guest room. She opened it slowly, carefully, and withdrew the key. Then she took a folded note from beneath the lining, worn and creased, and read it again. My dearest Evelyn, if anything should happen to me, it will be because of what I found. You must not speak to anyone, not even Lionel. The key will guide you, but only if you understand what it unlocks is not a door, but the past. W.D. Her hands trembled. She replaced the note, but this time not in the drawer. She tucked it into her handbag, then stared into the darkness a moment longer. Down the hall, Mrs. Dunthorpe stirred. The grandfather clock chimed 10. In the window across the street, behind twitching curtains, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, watching the stars emerge, one by one. The day of the cabinet room. Reopening dawned grey and uneasy, as though even the weather hesitated to shine too brightly on what was, by all measures, a macabre affair. It was Lionel Drake's idea, intended, he said, to quell rumours and prove his innocence. But to those who gathered on the gravel path outside the Drake residence, it felt more like a performance. The conservatory had been cordoned off since the fête. Dust sheets hung over the windows, and a constable posted at the door. Now, with much formality and a brief speech from Lionel himself, the door was unlatched and the villagers invited in, a few at a time, to view the late Willoughby Drake's legendary collection. Miss Marple arrived late in the morning, having preferred to let the initial flurry of spectators pass. She moved slowly through the glass-walled room, her sharp eyes taking in the rows of artifacts, clay pots, jewel-toned beetles pinned behind glass, ceremonial daggers, ink-faded scrolls, all labelled in Willoughby's careful hand. Yet something had changed. She could feel it more than see it, a shift in the room's arrangement, as subtle as a missed note in a familiar melody. One case had been moved closer to the wall. Another shelf now held 3 statues instead of 4. As she neared the display of Middle Eastern amulets, she noted an empty recess, a rectangle of untouched dust surrounded by disturbed space. A missing object, small, perhaps recently removed. She looked around and found Evelyn Marchmont standing stiffly by the exit, her fingers clasped in front of her, eyes darting nervously from object to object as though expecting one to leap out and accuse her. Miss Marple moved to her side. "Extraordinary," she said softly. "The collection, I mean, such variety. So many tales waiting to be told." Evelyn nodded. "Yes. Some things shouldn't be collected. They were never meant to be owned." Miss Marple glanced sideways at her. "A wise observation, one that Willoughby Drake may have ignored too often. Did you know him well, my dear?" There was the slightest pause, only vaguely. "We'd corresponded about a donation to the Italian Heritage Foundation I work with. He was polite, and then he invited me to the fete." "How unexpected," Miss Marple murmured. "And generous." Evelyn looked at her, something flickering behind her eyes. "Do you believe he was murdered?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that people often tell the truth with their actions, even when their words lie." She said no more, but left Evelyn looking unsettled as the next group filed in. That afternoon, a hushed conversation took place in the vicarage garden. Miss Marple had invited Lionel Drake and Sergeant Ridley to tea, though both arrived warily, each uncertain whether he had been summoned for cake or cross-examination. "I've been thinking about the nature of secrets," Miss Marple said, once the plates were cleared and the teapot refilled. "In villages, of course, we're very good at keeping them, but they often turn to poison when stored too long." Ridley straightened. "Are you referring to something specific, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she said gently. I'm referring to Esme Laurentis. Lionel flinched. It was small, but unmistakable. I'm sure you remember her, Miss Marple went on, tone still light. A woman both you and your brother cared for. She died in 1913, according to the stone at least, but I've reason to believe she did not die of natural causes. What are you suggesting? Lionel asked sharply. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Not that you killed her. No, but I believe her death, and the manner in which it was covered up, shaped everything that followed, including your estrangement from Willoughby and perhaps this latest tragedy. Ridley looked confused. Covered up? I've seen no record of that. Of course not, Miss Marple said. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a mother. She was inconvenient, and so she disappeared. But someone buried her all the same and had the decency or guilt to mark her grave, however simply. Lionel's voice was tight. Why bring
her up now? Because I believe she is the reason Willoughby invited Evelyn Marchmont to the fete, Miss Marple replied.
And why he feared something enough to send for you in the first place. You see, I believe Evelyn is Esme's daughter. Silence fell across the garden. Lionel looked stunned, speechless for the first time since his arrival in Little Witchwood. Resembles Esme, Miss Marple continued, more closely than I had realized at first, and the timing fits. A birth in secret, perhaps abroad, raised away from scandal only to seek out answers when she came of age. Ridley spoke finally. But if that's true, then her motive could be many things, Miss Marple said. Resentment, inheritance, or perhaps simply the truth. She may have discovered something hidden in the collection, something Willoughby never intended anyone to see, and that object, whatever it was, is now missing. That evening, Miss Marple paid a final visit to the cabinet room. Lionel had given her leave to search freely, and she walked alone through the exhibits as twilight gathered beyond the glass. There, in a low drawer beneath the Egyptian display, she found it, a torn envelope partially tucked behind a row of scrolls. It was addressed to Evelyn Marchmont and dated 2 weeks before the fete. Inside was a note in Willoughby Drake's hand. I made a mistake.
Many mistakes, but you deserve to know the truth. The key opens more than a drawer. It opens a confession and perhaps redemption. She stood there a long moment, staring at the note. The handwriting was firm but slanted, evidence of a man.
Still in control, still deliberate, no panic, no fear. And yet he had died within days of writing it. Miss Marple tucked the note carefully into her handbag, then turned to leave. But she stopped at the door. A faint rustling had caught her ear. From behind a curtain near the back of the conservatory, Evelyn Marchmont stepped forward. She looked pale and drawn, the same key glinting faintly from a chain around her neck. I thought you might find it, she said. Then you know what it means?
I do now, Evelyn whispered. He wasn't going to confess everything. He was going to hide behind another half-truth, pretend it was regret. But it wasn't enough. Did you confront him? Yes. Just before the fete. I told him I knew who my mother was, that I knew about the affair. He denied it at first. Then he said she died of fever. But I could tell, there was more. Something dark. Something he wouldn't say. And the scarab? It was hers. He took it from her, I think. And when I saw it again, I knew. He'd never forgotten her, never repented. Just locked it away like everything else. There was a long pause. Did you kill him, Evelyn? Evelyn's
eyes filled with tears. No, I wanted to, but I didn't. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you," she said at last. But someone else knew what he planned to confess. Someone who feared what would be revealed. She stepped past Evelyn and into the night. Behind her, the glass panes of the cabinet room caught the last of the dying light, the artifacts within gleaming like distant, silent witnesses. The following morning brought an unwelcome jolt to Little. Witchwood's already frayed composure, word spread quickly, carried in urgent knocks on cottage doors and breathless whispers along the high street. Someone had broken into the Drake residence during the night. By the time Miss Marple arrived, a small knot of villagers had already gathered beyond the wrought iron gate, craning their necks as Constable Phipps, looking decidedly flustered, stood on the front step taking statements from a rattled Mrs. Inglethorpe. There was glass on the kitchen floor. The housekeeper exclaimed, "And the back door was ajar, wide open, mind, but nothing stolen, nothing at all. I checked the drawing room and the cabinet. Everything's where it should be." "Except it isn't," said a voice from the hallway. Lionel Drake emerged, dishevelled and tense. He looked like a man who had either slept in his clothes or not at all. Miss Marple approached quietly. "What's missing, Mr. Drake?" He hesitated, rubbing his jaw. "A box, locked, oak. It held papers, letters mostly, some receipts, 1 or 2 written confessions." "Confessions?" "Of poor business dealings, a few questionable acquisitions. I had asked Willoughby to begin setting things right. He refused, but I kept the evidence." "And you believe someone came to destroy it?" Lionel's eyes flickered. "Or to find something I didn't know I had?" Behind him, Constable Phipps coughed discreetly. "No sign of forced entry, sir. The broken glass appears to have come from inside, from a vase knocked over. Someone could have had a key." "A key?" Miss Marple echoed. "So many in this case, and yet so few answers." Lionel turned to her sharply. "Do you still suspect me?" "I suspect that secrets tend to rot," she said softly. "And someone, perhaps more than one, has spent a long time hiding what should have come to light long ago." She glanced toward the path where Sergeant Ridley was now arriving at a hurried trot. The sergeant greeted her with a nod, his face flushed from the walk. "We've had word from Much Biddington," he said, lowering his voice. "The scarab, not just decorative, traces of powdered abrin inside, applied along the underside." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Abrin. The toxin from the rosary pea." "Exactly. Quite deadly in even small amounts. Rare, but known in antiquities circles. It's used in certain rituals absorbed through the skin." "Meaning," Miss Marple said slowly, "someone didn't need to stab or poison Willoughby in the traditional sense. He only needed to hold it," Ridley nodded grimly. "Which he did. According to witnesses, he was found with it beside him. Likely handled it before he sat down, or someone made sure he did." Miss Marple looked toward the conservatory where the scarab had been returned to its case, cleaned and secured. "But it was already in his collection," Ridley said. "So why now? Why would it suddenly be weaponized?" The answer, Miss Marple thought, lay not in the object itself, but in what it represented: a memory, a message, or a warning. The next piece of the puzzle came not from a clue, but from a person. That same afternoon, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage to tend her dahlias, she was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Evelyn Marchmont. She stood at the threshold, pale and drawn, clutching a small envelope and an expression of conflicted resolve. "I found this," she said, "hidden in the lining of my mother's jewellery case. I brought it with me when I came. I wasn't even sure why. But now—" She handed the envelope to Miss Marple, who took it gently and gestured her inside. The note inside was written in elegant, looping script. Clearly Esme's. To my daughter, if you ever find this, know that I loved you. I left England not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. Willoughby was never meant to harm me, but secrets, once shared, grow dangerous. If anything ever happens, do not trust Lionel. He is not what he seems. Miss Marple read the words twice. When did you find this? Last night, after the break-in. I couldn't sleep and something told me to check. I think it was meant for me all along, but I don't know what it means. Miss Marple looked up, her expression unreadable. It means, dear child, that your mother was more frightened than we knew, and that perhaps the wrong Drake brother was trusted all these years. That evening, a storm rolled in from the north, bringing with it a wind that rattled shutters and drove even the most determined. Gossip indoors. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, candlelight casting long shadows as she reviewed her notes. Pieces were beginning to fall into place, though not all comfortably. Lionel's unexpected inheritance, the missing key, Evelyn's secret lineage, and now
Esme's letter, pointing to Lionel as the greater threat. But something still didn't sit right.
If Lionel had truly orchestrated his brother's death, why come back at all? Why not remain in exile and let the old man's health take its course? Unless, of course, Lionel hadn't known he'd been named in the will, unless someone else had.
Known and acted preemptively. Miss Marple was interrupted by a sudden knock, sharp and urgent. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Weatherby on the step, her usual placid demeanour replaced by alarm. "Jane," she whispered, "come."
Quickly, it's Mrs. Inglethorpe. She's collapsed. Miss Marple arrived at the Drake residence within minutes. The housekeeper was lying on the drawing-room floor, pale and sweating, her breath shallow. Dr. Partridge had been summoned and knelt beside her, frowning. "She'll live," he said. "Looks like poisoning. Something in her tea, perhaps." "We've sent a sample to be tested." Miss Marple stood silently at the sideboard where the teacups had been laid out, one untouched, one half drunk, a small tin of biscuits now removed from reach. "She was alone?" Miss Marple asked. "No," said Mrs. Cribben, who had arrived with Evelyn and been helping to tidy the room. "We'd just come by for a visit." Evelyn had barely sipped her own tea when Mrs. Inglethorpe collapsed. Miss Marple turned to Evelyn. "Did you see her pour the tea?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, it was already poured when we arrived. She said she had just sat down." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the fireplace, where the poker had been moved, not quite aligned. A detail, a small, unimportant thing. But it tugged at her. She stepped into the kitchen. On the counter was the familiar tin of biscuits. She opened it. Nestled between two shortbread rounds was a fine white powder. She resealed the tin and returned to the parlour. "Sergeant Ridley should be sent for," she said. "And the biscuit tin taken into evidence?" Evelyn stared. "Do you think someone tried to silence her?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Mrs. Inglethorpe knew something she wasn't supposed to, and someone decided it was safer if she took her knowledge to the grave." "But she didn't die," Evelyn whispered. "No," Miss Marple said, folding her hands. "But someone else may, very soon." Later that night, when the rain pounded down and the wind howled against the windows, Miss Marple sat with a single candle flickering by her side. The killer was growing bold, too bold, which meant the end was coming soon. But not, she resolved, before the truth was brought fully into the light. The next morning dawned washed and quiet, the storm having passed, but leaving behind a curious stillness in its wake. The village of Little Witchwood seemed to hold its breath, as if collectively aware that something was coming to a head. People went about their business, but slower, with more glances over shoulders, more silence between greetings. The very air seemed tuned to a different pitch. At the vicarage, where gossip often flourished under the guise of prayer, Miss Felicity Pomfret declared, "There's something wicked afoot. First Mr. Drake, now poor Mrs. Inglethorpe. It won't end with her, you mark my words." Miss Marple heard none of it that morning. She was in her garden, pruning the roses with deliberate care, as though each snip of her shears could untangle a knot in her thoughts. When the last bloom had been trimmed and her gloves removed, she returned inside and made 2 telephone calls, one to Sergeant Ridley, and the second, more quietly, to the Crown and Stag Inn. She arranged with polite precision a gathering, not of the villagers this time, nor even of the curious, just 4 people. By tea-time they were all seated in the parlour of her modest cottage: Lionel Drake, pale and tense; Evelyn Marchmont, wary, a slight tremble in her gloved fingers; Sergeant Ridley, notebook at the ready; and finally, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Weatherby, calm, smiling, and perched as always at the edge of her seat like a woman used to hearing secrets rather than keeping them. Miss Marple poured tea for each with perfect civility. "Sugar, Mr. Drake?" "No," he said. "Miss Marchmont?" "Just one, thank you." "Mrs. Weatherby?" "2, dear. You know me." Sergeant Ridley declined. When all was served, Miss Marple sat down with her own cup and looked around the room with gentle eyes. There was nothing dramatic in her tone, nothing that hinted at the climax of a mystery, but every word that followed was like a carefully placed chess move. "I must begin," she said, "with something that has long troubled me. Mr. Willoughby Drake died, not by accident nor natural causes, but by contact with a very particular poison, abrin, traced, as we now know, to a scarab in his own collection." Lionel shifted in his seat. Evelyn looked down. Only Mrs. Weatherby smiled serenely. Miss Marple continued. "The curious thing, of course, is why now? That scarab had sat undisturbed for years. Its danger was only realized when it was
activated. Someone prepared it very recently. Someone who knew it would be handled during the fete." Ridley nodded. "We believe it was placed prominently, almost deliberately, within reach." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "So the question
becomes who had motive, access, and knowledge." Her gaze rested first on Lionel. "You, Mr. Drake, had motive, financial certainly, but I believe you were telling the truth when you said you didn't know you were named in the will. If you had known, you wouldn't have come at all. Or you would have come much earlier." Lionel
nodded once, slowly. "And Evelyn," Miss Marple continued, turning to the young woman, "you had more than motive. You had a story, a legacy."
"A sense of betrayal passed down from your mother, who was wronged by both brothers, Willoughby's lies and Lionel's abandonment. You came not to avenge, I think, but to understand. And then you found something far more dangerous than bitterness, the truth." Evelyn whispered. "I never meant for him to die." "I believe you," Miss Marple said kindly. "Your anger was real, but your heart is not cruel. But there is someone here," she went on, setting down her teacup, "whose hand in all this has remained carefully hidden, whose presence has been steady, familiar, comforting even, and yet whose knowledge of the Drake household and its routines surpasses even that of the family." Her eyes turned at last to Mrs. Weatherby. "Would you care for another sugar lump, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, lifting the tongs. Mrs. Weatherby's smile faltered just slightly. "No, thank you." "You've always liked your tea sweet," Miss Marple continued. You know everyone's habits, their vices, their secrets. You were friends with Esme Laurentis, weren't you? The air shifted. She confided in you before she left. Or perhaps after she was made to leave. She was foolish, Mrs. Weatherby said softly. Romantic. She thought Willoughby would divorce some abstract notion of duty. She was going to destroy everything, the Drake name, the respectability. And for what? Love? She was pregnant. It would have been a scandal. So you helped her vanish, Miss Marple said. And then, for years, you watched. And when Evelyn returned and Willoughby grew careless, you saw the danger again. Only this time, the scandal wouldn't just ruin reputations. It might uncover.
A very old sin indeed. Ridley leaned forward. You're saying Mrs. Weatherby killed Willoughby Drake? She didn't intend to, not at first, Miss Marple replied.
I believe she merely intended to warn him, to frighten him into silence. But something changed. Perhaps she overheard Willoughby's plan to confess to Evelyn. Perhaps she realized her carefully preserved image of the past would be ruined. So she chose the scarab, a relic she knew he prized, and she laced it with abrin, knowing full well he would touch it. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes were fixed on the window now, her face unreadable. Then, Miss Marple went on, when Mrs. Inglethorpe began to suspect perhaps she overheard something, or noticed your absence from the fete, you tried again, this time with poisoned biscuits. But she survived, Ridley said. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. And now the truth has come. A long silence followed. Mrs. Weatherby, composed as ever, reached slowly for her teacup. She took a single.
Sip, you're clever, Jane, she said softly. Always were. I wondered if you'd see it. I only see what people show me, Miss Marple said. Even when they don't mean to. Mrs. Weatherby set the cup down with a sigh. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted peace.
I've kept this village whole for decades, Jane. You know that. I made sure it stayed tidy, untouched, the past buried. People forget that some of us are willing to sacrifice for order. Ridley stood slowly, his expression stunned. You'll come with me now, Mrs. Weatherby? She nodded, rising gracefully. Of course, Sergeant. I've had my tea. Miss Marple said nothing more as they left. She merely watched the door close and folded her hands in her lap. Evelyn remained, her eyes wide, her body still as stone. She killed him, she whispered. Because of me? No, Miss Marple said softly. Because of what you represented, the return of truth. And some.
People, my dear, fear truth more than death.
That night, as the news spread and the village reeled, Miss Marple returned to her garden. The dahlias had come back into bloom, bold and unapologetic. She stood among them for a long while, listening to the wind in the hedgerows, the distant toll of the church bell, and the silence that followed. It was over, or rather, it had finally begun. The morning after Mrs. Weatherby's quiet arrest, little Witchwood woke not with scandal, but with a kind of stunned reverence. People spoke in lowered tones at the bakery and the post office. The news had not yet made the local papers, but it no longer needed to. Everyone knew. Or at least they thought they did. It was Miss Marple who knew the full truth. The confession made in her parlour, graceful, precise, chilling, had tied the threads together. Yet even as the village began to reweave its peaceful facade, she felt one loose end still tugging at her thoughts, the kind that frayed, if not secured. By mid-morning she was seated across from Lionel Drake at the Crown and Stag. He had insisted on a private word. The fire was lit despite the warming weather, and he paced in front of it like a
man walking through old smoke. I can't decide whether I'm relieved or furious, he said, eyes flicking toward her.
She fooled us all. I trusted her. Everyone did. Mrs. Weatherby was trusted precisely because she appeared incapable of such a thing, Miss Marple replied. And in a way she wasn't motivated by malice, at least not as it's typically understood. She murdered him. She believed she was protecting something larger than him, the reputation of your family, the village, the illusion that nothing ever changes here. Lionel exhaled slowly and sat down across from her. There's something...
I must ask, something I didn't say at the time? I thought there might be, she said gently. He reached into his coat and drew out a thin, yellowed sheet of paper.
He unfolded it with great care and placed it before her. My brother left this in the oak box, hidden behind a false panel, the one that was stolen before it was returned, oddly enough. The thief left the box by the back hedge 2 days ago, empty, save for this. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read it silently. The note was in Willoughby's hand. If Evelyn ever discovers the truth, tell her I wanted to tell her myself.
I loved her mother. Even after all the mistakes, I lied because I thought it would protect her. But the collection, one item, it holds the proof. She deserves to know what was stolen from her. She read it twice, then looked up. You see, Lionel said quietly, I believe there's still something missing.
Something more than the key, a final secret. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Yes, the thing Evelyn came looking for, and which Mrs. Weatherby feared would destroy you both. The item in the collection, Lionel said. Do you know what it is? I believe I do, Miss Marple said softly. But we must let Evelyn find it herself. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet Evelyn Marchmont in the cabinet room. Lionel provided access once more, and Sergeant Ridley, though reluctant to allow the disturbance of a possible crime scene, agreed to a final supervised inspection. Evelyn stood among the artifacts like someone on the edge of a memory she'd never had. She moved slowly from case to case, pausing here at a painted urn, there at a Roman coin. Her gloved fingers drifted along the dusty labels, eyes scanning, seeking. Miss Marple waited patiently until Evelyn stopped before a small display of antiquities from northern Africa. Several small clay tablets, a cracked amulet, and a bronze medallion sat arranged behind the glass. It's not here, Evelyn whispered. It is, Miss Marple said. Only it's disguised. Evelyn turned. Miss Marple stepped forward and pointed. The medallion. It's not bronze, it's gilded tin, very out of place in this collection. And see the markings? Not from Egypt, not from Carthage, but they are a cipher, a code. Your mother left it for Willoughby, and he kept it, not to destroy it, but because he couldn't bear to part with it. Sergeant Ridley opened the case. Evelyn took the medallion into her hands and examined it closely. Beneath the faded gold leaf were etched initials, E.L., and beneath that, a series of numbers. A date, Evelyn said. And coordinates, Miss Marple nodded. I believe those. Numbers refer to a property, an old house in Trieste your mother once mentioned in letters, a place she stayed while she was expecting. I imagine if you go there you'll find papers, proof, perhaps even journals. Evelyn's fingers closed around the medallion. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, all these years, she said. He
kept this, even after all the lies. Why? Because he regretted them, Miss Marple said. He was a collector, my dear.
But some things, love, guilt, loss, cannot be arranged on a shelf. So he hid them. But not so well that they couldn't be found when the time was right. Evelyn stood silently for a long moment, the medallion still clutched in her hand. Then she turned to Miss Marple. Will you come with me? She asked softly. To Trieste? The older woman smiled gently. My days of foreign travel are long past, my dear. But I can write to someone there, a friend. She'll meet you and help you find what you need. Evening, Miss Marple returned home, her steps slow but steady. In her sitting room, she made herself a modest supper and sat by the window as the light faded from the sky. Birds gathered along the hedgerow, and somewhere down the lane a dog barked, sharp and sudden, then fell silent again. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Sergeant Ridley hat in hand. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. Mrs. Weatherby gave a full confession. He even added a bit we didn't know. She'd intercepted Willoughby's first letter to Evelyn weeks before the fete, burned it, thought that would be the end of it. Miss Marple nodded. "And yet it was only the beginning," she said. She didn't regret it. Still claims she saved the village. "Perhaps she did," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps she simply delayed the reckoning." Ridley looked at her with a faint, amused smile. "You always know, don't you?" "No," she replied, "but I always watch. That's the thing. People think they hide their worst behind silence, but it's how they speak, the pauses, the hesitations, that reveal everything." He tipped his cap. "Well, thank you again, Miss Marple. I suppose you'll want to rest now." She closed the door behind him and returned to her armchair. In her lap, her knitting lay half-finished. Beside her, a letter from her nephew Raymond sat unopened, promising a most diverting novel and updates from London. But for now, she simply sat. Outside, the wind whispered through the foxgloves and the stars began to appear. First one, then another, then all at once. The final secret had come to light, but human nature, Miss Marple knew, would always hold more. A week had passed since the revelation, and little Witchwood had begun the quiet process of returning to itself. The spring fete had been dismantled, its bunting folded neatly away in the church vestry, the tea urns scrubbed, the tables returned to the village hall, flowers bloomed, postmen whistled again, and gossip resumed its natural course, no longer about death, but about who had been seen in the company of whom, and what Mrs. Cribbins had said about the new curate's trousers. And yet a faint air of unease still hung in the corners of parlours, and crept along garden fences like smoke that hadn't quite cleared. Murder, even the genteel, whispered kind, left behind a lingering residue. The Drake house stood empty now, its blinds drawn and the conservatory locked once more. Lionel Drake had left for London, promising to return after sorting the necessary legal affairs, though most suspected he would never call little Witchwood home again. As for Evelyn Marchmont, she had departed 2 days prior with a suitcase and a quiet resolve, bound for Trieste. She had promised to write. Miss Marple, who never put much stock in promises, had smiled warmly and sent her off with a small parcel of lavender soap and a suggestion for a pensione run by a very honest widow. Mrs. Weatherby, meanwhile, was in custody in Much Biddington. Her confession had been thorough, her demeanour unshaken. She had taken tea every day since her arrest and asked politely for lemon. Her only regret, she claimed, was the fright she had caused Mrs. Inglethorpe. Miss Marple herself had resumed her daily routine with quiet grace, walking to the bakery for a fresh loaf, watering the roses in the morning, and sitting by the fire, with her knitting in the evening. But something had settled in her, a soft, thoughtful weight, the kind that didn't ask to be named. She was sitting in her parlour on one such evening, when the knock came. "Jane," said Reverend Penfleet as she opened the door, "may I come in?" "Of course, Vicar," she said, stepping aside. "You
Look troubled. Not the sermon again?" He smiled, but only faintly. I've just returned from visiting Mrs. Weatherby. Oh? She asked for me? Said she wished to make a final confession. Spiritual, I mean. Miss Marple's eyebrows
lifted. And did she? She did, and I find myself unsettled. She poured him tea as he sat down heavily in the chair by the hearth. She said she didn't intend to kill Willoughby. Not truly. She meant only to sicken him, frighten him into staying quiet about Evelyn. She admitted to preparing the scarab.
Yes, but she claimed the dose was not lethal. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her expression unreadable.
That is curious, she said. More than curious, said the vicar. Because Dr. Partridge told me something rather strange this morning. He had the final toxicology report. The traces of abrin were there, yes, but not enough, in his opinion, to kill a man outright. Not instantly, it might have made him weak. Ill, yes, but death? It doesn't align with the timeline. Miss Marple sat very still. You think she lied? The vicar asked. About the dose? Miss Marple shook her head. No, I think she told the truth. Finally. Which means... She stood, moving to the small bureau in the corner. From its drawer, she retrieved a folded envelope. I hadn't meant to trouble you with this, she said, handing it to him. But I think now you should see it. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a page torn from a ledger. A list of items catalogued in Willoughby Drake's hand. But one item, added later, was circled in red ink. Syringe, silver Persian, 18th century? Hollow needle, unknown residue. The vicar looked up. You found this? In the oak box. Hidden beneath the documents Lionel recovered. I've kept it quiet for now. But that means... Yes, said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Weatherby prepared the scarab, true, but someone else, someone more precise, more ruthless, delivered the final blow, a second dose, direct.
Likely injected, the vicar swallowed. Then who... Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. It had to be someone close, someone who could approach him unnoticed, someone he trusted enough to turn his back on, someone who had reason not only to fear the truth, but to control it.
The vicar's eyes widened. Lionel? She nodded once. He returned because Willoughby summoned him, but when he discovered Evelyn and what she represented, he panicked. If the will had been changed again, if she had been added, it would all be lost. Everything. The house. The inheritance. The name. He couldn't bear it. And so he ensured the scarab would only seem to be the cause. She turned back from the window, her face tired but composed. Mrs. Weatherby provided the shadow, she said. But Lionel cast the darkness. It was Sergeant Ridley who brought Lionel in the next day, quietly, without fuss. The arrest was not made public. It didn't need to be. By then, the village had already moved on to speculating about the upcoming flower competition and whether Mrs. Pomfret's chrysanthemums had been entirely grown in her own garden. Lionel's second confession, obtained after a day's silence and a long walk in the jail yard, was devoid of drama. He had found the syringe among Willoughby's curios years ago, kept it hidden, cleaned it, and waited. When the opportunity came, when his brother slumped in that chair, dazed, weakened.
From the scarab's touch, he'd stepped in.
A simple prick behind the ear, so gentle, Willoughby never stirred. I made sure he wouldn't get up again, Lionel said. He was about to throw it all away, for a girl he didn't even raise. No remorse, no poetry, just a man who had once lost everything and refused to lose it twice. Miss Marple never spoke of the case again, not in public, not even to her nephew Raymond, who wrote a long letter from Italy saying Evelyn had found a parcel of old journals in Trieste. Esme's thoughts, dreams, and a photograph of a newborn swaddled in blue cotton. She was staying on for now. Perhaps
longer. She was writing a memoir. Miss Marple smiled at the thought. One quiet evening, months later, she sat alone in her parlour, a fresh pot of tea at her side and her knitting in her lap.
Outside, the foxgloves nodded in the wind, and somewhere far down the lane, church bells tolled faintly, 6:30. She looked out at the street beyond her garden wall. Children played hopscotch, a dog barked, a young couple walked past, their heads close, sharing a laugh. Little Witchwood had returned to itself, but not unchanged. She reached over and pulled the curtains half closed. Then, picking up her needles once more, she began to knit. As always, she chose a simple pattern. But if one looked closely, if one watched patiently, they might see something else. A complex twist in the middle, subtle and tight, just enough to keep the whole from unravelling. The summer sun returned to Little Witchwood, not with blazing fanfare, but in measured golden light, spilling over low stone walls and warming the hedgerows as though nature itself were attempting to soothe the village back into comfort. In the weeks following Lionel Drake's quiet arrest, the village resumed its rhythms. The baker returned to his usual jokes, Mrs. Pomfret resumed choir practice, and even Mrs. Inglethorpe was seen once more tending to the roses outside the Drake house, which now awaited auction. Few in Little Witchwood spoke of the double betrayal, the planned murder, and the silent accomplice, but it lived in the undercurrent of every conversation, like a ghost that politely kept corners. In her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat finishing her last letter to Evelyn Marchmont. The young woman had written from Trieste with news of her mother's journals and the papers that proved Willoughby Drake had intended to make a final amendment to his will, one naming Evelyn
as his sole heir.
The unsigned draft had been tucked inside a linen-bound volume on Babylonian astronomy, and though legally void, it had given Evelyn peace. "I've decided not to contest the inheritance," Evelyn had written. "Let the house be sold. Let the past rest. I will keep only what matters, my mother's words, and one item from the collection, the medallion." Miss Marple smiled as she folded the letter away. She admired Evelyn's restraint. Many young women might have been tempted by a house, a name, or the fortune it promised. But Evelyn, like her mother, had seen how easily such things could poison. Outside, the foxgloves nodded, and a finch sang from the gable of the church. All was once again deceptively peaceful. Later that day, Miss Marple was visited by Sergeant Ridley. "She'll be tried, of course," he said, referring to Mrs. Weatherby. "But the Crown may go lenient. Given her age, her record, and the part she played, it's complicated." "Most truths are," Miss Marple said. He shifted in his chair. "And Lionel? Oh, I expect he'll receive justice, the sort that's quiet and long, the kind that gives one time to consider each."
"Wrong step."
Ridley nodded. "You were right about everything." "I was right about people," she corrected gently. "About fear, pride, and love turned bitter. Not about the rest. That came from watching, listening, and knowing that what people conceal is often more important than what they reveal." He tipped his cap and left her to her tea. And so it was that the story of the Drake brothers, Esme Laurentiis, and the deadly scarab slowly slipped into the soft folds of village memory, spoken of less often, and only in hushed tones when the air was still and the fire low. But Miss Marple remembered. She remembered the way Evelyn's voice had trembled as she asked if the past could truly stay buried. She remembered the look on Lionel's face when he realized the game was over. Not outrage, but something colder. The quiet horror of a man who had believed himself clever enough to outplay conscience. And she remembered Willoughby Drake, eccentric, secretive, and doomed not by the things he collected, but by the one thing he could not let go. As she sat once more by her window that evening, her knitting in her lap and a pot of Earl Grey cooling beside her, Miss Marple allowed herself a single, silent reflection. People, she murmured, are like cabinets, locked up tight but never quite empty. And now and then, someone finds the key. She resumed her knitting, the soft clack of needles echoing faintly in the room. Outside, the village breathed. The wind rustled through the hedgerows. The church bell tolled 7, and in Little Witchwood, for now at least, all was still.